There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a dinner table right after someone you love has been humiliated. It isn't quiet. It's loud. It rings in your ears louder than any shout ever could. I know that silence intimately, because I sat inside it for what felt like an hour, though the clock on my mother's dining room wall says it was only 4 seconds. 4 seconds between the moment my father said the words that broke my husband's composure and the moment I stood up and ended my relationship with my parents forever. My name is Naomi. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that family was the one thing you never walked away from, no matter what. I believed that blood meant loyalty, that the people who raised you had earned a kind of permanent forgiveness, a blank check you kept signing over and over, year after year, insult after insult, because that's what good daughters do. I believed that so completely that it took my husband being humiliated in front of me, in my childhood home, at a table where I once did my homework as a little girl, for me to finally understand that some blank checks bounce. Some debts can never be repaid because the people who owe them never intended to pay in the first place. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because if I only tell you about that dinner, you won't understand why it broke something in me that had been cracking quietly for years. You'll think I'm dramatic. You'll think one bad comment ended a relationship with my own parents. But it wasn't one comment. It was the last stone thrown onto a pile that had been building since the day I brought Daniel home for the first time. Daniel and I met 7 years ago, in a small coffee shop near the hospital where I worked as a physical therapist. He was sitting alone with a laptop covered in stickers, wearing a flannel shirt that had clearly been washed 100 times, and when he looked up and smiled at me, something in my chest just settled. That's the only way I can describe it. Like a door closing gently instead of slamming. I'd gone into that coffee shop on the worst day I'd had in months, a patient I'd been working with for half a year, a young man recovering from a spinal injury. Had suffered a setback that morning that made me question whether any of my work with him had mattered at all. I sat 2 tables away from Daniel, staring into a cappuccino I had no intention of drinking, and I must have looked as hollow as I felt, because at some point he leaned over and said, without any preamble at all, "You look like you need someone to tell you a stupid joke." I told him I probably did. He told me a joke so bad I actually laughed out loud for the first time in days, and then he apologized for interrupting, gathered his things, and started to leave. I was the one who asked him to stay. I've never regretted asking a single question more than I've cherished that one. Daniel was a mechanic. Not the kind who fixes cars for the wealthy in a shiny dealership with a tie and a name tag, but the kind who owns a small independent garage, who comes home every night with grease under his fingernails that no amount of soap can fully remove. Who works with his hands and his back and his patience. He grew up in a small town 2 hours from the city, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses to put food on the table. He never went to college. He built his garage from nothing, one loyal customer at a time, over 12 years of 60-hour weeks, starting with a single rented bay and a second-hand toolbox his mother had scraped together the money to buy him as a graduation gift. I fell in love with him slowly and then all at once, the way people always say it happens, except in my case, it really did. He was kind in a way that felt unfamiliar to me. He listened when I spoke instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He remembered small details, the name of my coworker's dog, the fact that I hated cilantro, the anniversary of my grandmother's death, and he brought them up months later, unprompted, just to show me he'd been paying attention. He never once made me feel small. That last part matters more than you might realize yet. Keep it in mind. I'll come back to it. In those early months, I found myself constantly comparing him, almost against my will, to the version of a partner I'd been raised to expect. My mother used to describe the kind of man I should end up with in a very specific vocabulary: established, ambitious, going places. Daniel didn't fit any of those words the way she meant them, but he had his own vocabulary that I came to love even more. He was steady. He was present. He showed up early and stayed late, not just at the garage, but in every part of his life, including mine. The first time I got sick that winter, He drove across town at 11 at night with soup from the only place still open, and sat on the floor of my apartment doing paperwork for his shop so I wouldn't be alone while I slept it off. Nobody had ever done anything like that for me before. I didn't know, until then, how starved I'd been for that kind of ordinary, unglamorous devotion. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, are what you might call old money adjacent, not truly wealthy, but comfortable enough, proud enough, and desperate enough to seem more important than they are. My father spent 30 years as a partner at a mid-sized law firm. My mother never worked a day after marrying him, but she filled her time with charity boards and country club luncheons and a very specific, very rigid idea of what a successful life was supposed to look like. To them, success wore a suit. Success had a business card. Success came from the right university and married someone from an equally right family. I was their only daughter, and from the time I was small, I understood, without anyone ever saying it outright, that I was expected to be a reflection of them. My grades had to be exceptional, not because learning mattered, but because a bad report card was a personal insult to my father's reputation. My clothes had to be tasteful, my friends had to be from the right families, my achievements had to be things my mother could mention at brunch with a practiced little smile of pride. I remember being 9 years old and overhearing my mother tell a friend, on the phone, that I'd placed second in a regional spelling bee, and hearing the disappointment buried under her forced enthusiasm, because second wasn't a story worth telling at brunch the way first would have been. So when I brought Daniel home for the first time, 3 months into our relationship, I already knew, somewhere in my gut, that it wasn't going to go well. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself my parents would see what I saw, a good man, a hardworking man, someone who loved me without condition. I was wrong, and I was wrong in a way that should have warned me about everything that came after. My mother greeted him at the door with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one. She looked him up and down, just for a second, but long enough that I saw it, and long enough that I think Daniel saw it too, though he never said anything. My father shook his hand with the kind of grip men use when they want you to know they could crush you if they wanted to. Over dinner, my father asked Daniel exactly 2 questions about his life. So, what is it you do? And do you have any plans to expand, or is this just it? Before spending the rest of the meal talking about his firm's newest case, a merger worth more money than Daniel probably made in 5 years. I remember driving home that night in silence, Daniel's hand resting on my knee, both of us pretending the evening had gone fine. It hadn't. But I told myself it would get better. I told myself that once they got to know him, once they saw how good he was to me, they would come around. I told myself a lot of things over the next several years, because believing the truth would have meant admitting that my parents' love for me had conditions attached to it that I wasn't sure I could ever fully meet. We got married 4 years later, in a small backyard ceremony that Daniel and I planned and paid for ourselves, because my parents made it very clear, in the gentlest and most devastating way possible, that they didn't feel comfortable investing in a wedding they had concerns about. I remember the exact phrase my mother used on the phone that day: "We just don't want to throw our support behind something we're not sure is going to last." As if love needed her underwriting to be real. As if 7 years, then and now, wasn't proof enough of anything. My mother cried at the ceremony. I remember that, because for one foolish moment, I thought they were tears of joy. Later, my cousin told me what my mother had actually said to her during the vows. I just always pictured something different for her. Not tears of joy. Tears of disappointment, dressed up to look like love. For the first 2 years of our marriage, my parents kept a careful, controlled distance from Daniel. They attended the holidays we couldn't avoid together. They asked polite, hollow questions about the garage, always with a faint emphasis that made the word sound smaller than it was. They never once asked Daniel about his mother, or his childhood, or what he loved about his work, or what he dreamed about for our future. They treated him like a phase I was going through, an embarrassing detour on the way to some life they still believed I would eventually choose instead. There's one memory from those early years I haven't told many people. 2 Christmases into our marriage, My mother handed out gifts to everyone at the family gathering, engraved pens for my cousin's new law associate position, a cashmere scarf for my aunt, a leather planner for my uncle. For Daniel, she handed him a gift card to an auto parts store. $50. She'd wrapped it. She'd clearly put thought into the wrapping paper, the bow, the little tag, and she'd apparently put zero thought into what it said about how she saw him. Not as a person with interests or a life outside his work, but as a function. A mechanic. A tool that fixed other people's cars, deserving of a tool-shaped gift in return. Daniel thanked her graciously, the way he thanked her for everything, and later that night, when we were alone, I found him quietly turning the gift card over in his hands with an expression I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was nothing. I know now it was one more brick in a wall that had been building for years. I told myself I could manage it. I told myself that as long as they were civil, I could keep both worlds, my husband and my parents, orbiting around me without ever colliding. I built an entire emotional architecture around that belief, propping up two relationships that were fundamentally incompatible, telling myself that if I just tried hard enough, if I just kept the peace carefully enough, everyone could coexist. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's just delay. And the bill for that delay was coming due, whether I was ready to pay it or not. What I didn't know, on the morning of my father's 65th birthday dinner, the dinner where everything finally broke, was that this would be the last time I would ever sit at that table as their daughter in the way I had always understood the word. I thought it was just another family dinner, another evening of careful smiles and careful subjects and careful silences. I had no idea that by the time dessert was served, I would be standing up, taking my husband's hand, and walking out of my parents' house for what would become the final time. I had no idea that the woman who left that dinner would be someone entirely different from the woman who walked in. Someone who finally understood that you cannot love people into treating you with respect. Someone who finally understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your marriage, for your own dignity, for the man who has never once made you feel small, is to walk away from the people who taught you what smallness felt like in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that evening, table by table, word by word, so you understand exactly what happened and exactly why I could never go back. My father's 65th birthday dinner was supposed to be a small affair, just family, my mother said, when she called to invite us. Just us and your Uncle Peter's family, nothing fancy. I should have known that nothing fancy in my mother's vocabulary still meant a caterer, place cards, and a seating chart designed with the precision of a diplomatic summit. But I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get through the evening, the way I'd gotten through so many evenings before. Daniel almost didn't come. He'd had a long week at the garage, a big transmission job that ran late, 3 days in a row of coming home exhausted, his hands raw from the work. I could sit this one out, he offered gently, the way he always did when he sensed I needed an easier night. But I asked him to come. I told him it mattered to me that we showed up as a couple, together, present. I didn't tell him the real reason, which was that some small, hopeful part of me still believed that if we just kept showing up, kept being patient, kept being kind, my parents would eventually soften. I was still trying to build a bridge between two shores that had never once been connected. We arrived at 7, Daniel in the nicest shirt he owned, a soft blue button-down I'd bought him for our anniversary, his hair still slightly damp from a rushed shower after work. He'd scrubbed his hands twice, I noticed, the way he always did before seeing my parents, as if he could scrub away whatever it was they saw when they looked at him. That detail alone should have told me everything about how much their opinion of him had quietly worn him down over the years, even though he never complained, never once asked me to choose between them. In the car on the way over, he'd been unusually quiet, and when I asked what he was thinking about, he told me, half joking, half not, that he'd been rehearsing small talk in his head, the way you might rehearse for a job interview. I always feel like I'm being graded at your parents' house, he said, and I laughed it off in the moment because I didn't want to admit, out loud, that he was completely right. The dinner started well enough. My Uncle Peter told long, boring stories about his golf trip. My aunt asked about my work at the clinic. My mother floated around refilling wine glasses with the practiced hospitality of a woman who has hosted 100 dinners exactly like this one. Daniel sat quietly beside me, polite, present, doing his best to engage in conversations about country clubs and stock portfolios that had nothing to do with his world. At one point, he made an easy joke about a customer who'd tried to pay him in homemade jam instead of cash, and my aunt laughed, a real laugh, and for a moment I let myself believe the evening might actually go fine. It was somewhere around the main course when my father, 3 glasses of wine into the evening and feeling expansive, turned the conversation toward his favorite subject, his own success. He talked about the merger his firm had just closed. He talked about the new lake house he and my mother were considering. He talked, as he often did, about building something real, a phrase I'd heard my whole life, always delivered with a certain weight, as if he were bestowing wisdom rather than simply talking about himself. He mentioned, not for the first time, the exact square footage of the lake house and the name of the architect they were considering. And I watched Daniel nod along politely at numbers that probably represented more money than his garage would clear in 3 good years combined. And then my Uncle Peter, trying to include Daniel, trying to be kind in his own clumsy way, turned to him and asked, "So Daniel, business good? You thinking about expanding at all? Opening a second location maybe?" It was an innocent question. Daniel answered it the way he always did, honestly, without embarrassment, with the quiet pride of a man who has built something with his own 2 hands. "It's good, actually. We just hired a 4th mechanic last month. I'd love to expand eventually, but I want to make sure we're doing it right, not just doing it fast." There was a pause. And then my father laughed. Not a warm laugh. Not the kind of laugh that invites someone else to laugh along with you. A short, sharp laugh, the kind that lands like a slap. "Right," my father said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Because there's nothing worse than a mechanic who overextends himself. God forbid you end up in over your head fixing brake pads." The table went quiet in that particular way tables go quiet when everyone senses something is about to turn. My mother let out a small, nervous laugh, the kind she always used to smooth over my father's comments, as if laughter alone could soften the blade after it had already cut. My aunt suddenly became very interested in her plate. My Uncle Peter, realizing what he'd accidentally set in motion, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something to fix it, then closed it again. Daniel didn't flinch, not visibly. He'd had years of practice not flinching in that house. He just gave a small smile and said, "I think we'll manage," and reached for his water glass. I should tell you that I felt my whole body go rigid in that moment. I felt the old, familiar instinct rise up in me, the instinct to smooth things over, to change the subject, to protect the peace at any cost, the way I had done 100 times before. I opened my mouth to redirect the conversation toward something safer. But before I could, my father wasn't finished. "I mean it as a compliment, Daniel," my father continued, setting his glass down with theatrical care. "It takes a certain kind of man to be content with this. Not everyone needs to build an empire. Some people are just happy fixing what other people build." He looked around the table for validation, the way he always did, the way he'd done my whole childhood, turning cruelty into performance for an audience he assumed would applaud. And then he said the words that broke something in me permanently. "Naomi always did have a soft heart. Picking up strays." He smiled at me like he'd said something charming. "First it was that 3-legged dog in high school, now it's..." He gestured vaguely at Daniel with his wine glass, not even bothering to finish the sentence, letting the silence do the cruel work for him. I want you to understand what that silence contained. It contained 7 years of my husband being spoken to like an interruption in a life I was supposed to be living differently. It contained every holiday where my father asked Daniel exactly 2 polite, hollow questions before turning back to talk about his own achievements. It contained every time my mother introduced Daniel to her friends as Naomi's husband. "He's very hands-on with his work," said with a little laugh that made hands-on sound like a diagnosis. It contained the wedding they refused to help pay for, the birthday cards that never once acknowledged our anniversary, the $50 auto parts gift card wrapped up like an afterthought, the quiet, persistent, decades-long message that Daniel, my Daniel, the kindest man I had ever known, was somehow a disappointment I had chosen instead of a man I had chosen to love. I looked at Daniel. I watched his jaw tighten, just slightly, the only sign he ever gave that something had actually hurt him. He set his fork down carefully, like he was being careful not to let his hand shake. He didn't say anything. He never said anything, because 7 years of my family's quiet condescension had taught him that defending himself only ever made the room more uncomfortable for me, and he loved me too much to put me in that position. That was the moment I understood something I had spent years refusing to see. My husband had been absorbing these small cruelties, dinner after dinner, year after year, silently, so that I wouldn't have to choose between the man I loved and the parents who raised me. He had been protecting my peace at the cost of his own dignity, over and over, without ever once asking me to intervene. And I had let him. I had let him, because some small, cowardly part of me had been too afraid of what it would mean to finally stand up to my parents and say enough. I felt the old instinct rise in me one more time, the instinct to laugh it off, to say, "Dad, come on," in that light, placating tone I'd perfected over 34 years of being their daughter. I felt my mouth start to form the words. And then I looked at Daniel's face again, at the careful blankness he'd put on to protect me, and something in me simply refused to do it one more time. "What did you just say?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected, but it cut through the table like a blade. My father blinked, surprised. He wasn't used to being questioned. "I was just making a joke, Naomi. Don't be so sensitive. You called my husband a stray dog." "I did not say that," I said. "You compared him to a 3-legged dog I rescued in high school. In front of everyone. At his own. At a dinner he came to, tired, after working 60 hours this week, to celebrate your birthday." My voice was shaking now, but not from weakness. From something else entirely, from years of swallowed anger finally finding a way out. My mother reached over and put a hand on my arm. "Sweetheart, your father didn't mean anything by it. Let's not ruin the evening." And there it was. The sentence that had ended every difficult conversation in my family for as long as I could remember. Let's not ruin the evening. As if my father's cruelty was a minor inconvenience, and my reaction to it was the real disruption. As if the evening had been perfectly fine until I dared to notice it wasn't. I looked at my mother's hand on my arm, and for the first time in my life, I understood, really understood, in my bones, not just in my head, that my parents did not see Daniel as a person. They saw him as a problem to be managed, a mistake to be gently corrected, an embarrassment to be endured until I eventually came to my senses. And I understood something else, too, something even harder to accept. They didn't fully see me either. Not the real me. They saw a daughter-shaped extension of their own image, and every time I chose someone, that didn't fit that image, they treated it as a personal wound inflicted upon them, rather than a life I was allowed to live on my own terms. I turned to Daniel. His eyes met mine, and I saw something in them I'd never seen before in all our years together. Not anger, but a kind of quiet, exhausted resignation, as if he'd long ago accepted that this was simply the cost of loving me, and he'd made peace with paying it forever so I wouldn't have to lose my family. I wasn't willing to let him keep paying it. Not anymore. "Daniel," I said, standing up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "We're leaving." My father scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake, Naomi, sit down. It was a joke." "It wasn't a joke," I said. "It was 7 years of jokes. It was every dinner where you asked him 2 questions and then talked about yourself for an hour. It was every holiday card you never signed his name on properly. It was the wedding you refused to help with because you had concerns. It was every single time you made him feel like he had to earn a place at this table that I never once made him question at home." The table was silent. My aunt was staring at her plate like it held the answers to a question she didn't want to ask. My Uncle Peter looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My mother's hand was still on my arm, frozen there, her face pale. "I have spent 7 years trying to build a bridge between the two of you and him," I continued, my voice steadier now, stronger, like something long buried was finally rising to the surface. "I told myself if I was patient enough, if I kept the peace long enough, you would eventually see what I see. A good man. A hardworking man. A man who has never once, in 7 years, made me feel the way you just made him feel in 4 seconds. You're being dramatic, my father said, but there was something uncertain in his voice now, something that hadn't been there a moment ago. No, I said. I'm being honest. Probably for the first time in my adult life. I took Daniel's hand. He rose from his chair slowly, and I felt his fingers tighten around mine, not in anger, but in something that felt like gratitude, like relief, like a man who had waited 7 quiet years to finally be defended, and hadn't dared to hope it would actually happen. Happy birthday, Dad, I said, and I meant it as something between an apology to myself and a closing statement. I hope it was everything you wanted it to be. And we walked out. I remember the walk from the dining room to the front door felt endless, my heels loud against the marble entryway my mother had always been so proud of, my aunt calling my name once, softly, and neither of us turning back. I remember the cool night air hitting my face like something clarifying. I remember Daniel opening the car door for me, out of habit, even in that moment, even with his hands probably still shaking. I didn't cry until we got to the car. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just reached over, took my hand off the gear shift, and held it the entire drive home, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles, the way he always did when words weren't enough. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned to me and said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," I said, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "I did. I should have done it years ago." We sat in the driveway for a long time after that, the engine ticking as it cooled, neither of us in a hurry to go inside and let the ordinary rhythms of our life swallow up what had just happened. I told him things that night I'd never quite said out loud before, how I used to lie awake as a teenager rehearsing conversations with my father where I'd finally say the right thing and he'd finally understand me, conversations that never once happened in real life. How I used to think love from my parents was a performance I could eventually get right if I just studied hard enough. Daniel listened the way he always listened, without trying to fix it, just letting me say it. That night, lying awake beside him long after he'd fallen into an exhausted sleep, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been surgically removed from my chest. I kept replaying the dinner over and over, my father's laugh, my mother's hand on my arm, the careful blankness on Daniel's face that I now understood had been a mask worn for years to protect me from a choice I'd been too afraid to make. I thought about calling my mother the next morning to apologize, to smooth it over the way I always had, to find some middle path where I could keep both my parents and my dignity intact. I actually picked up my phone twice. But both times, I put it back down, because some new, unfamiliar clarity was settling into me, the understanding that there was no middle path left to find. There never had been. I had just been too afraid to admit it. 3 days later, my mother called. Not to apologize. To ask why I was punishing my father by not answering his texts, and to remind me that he was getting older and that family doesn't have forever. I listened to her for a full 2 minutes without saying anything, and then I said the words that would end our relationship as I'd known it for good. I'm not punishing him. I'm protecting my husband. If that's not something you can respect, then I don't think we have much left to talk about. She hung up on me. I didn't call back. In the weeks that followed, my father tried a different approach. He sent one long email, the kind of email a man writes when he's used to winning arguments in writing, full of phrases like, "I think you're overreacting," and "your mother," and "I have always supported you in our own way." He never once used the word sorry. He never once acknowledged what he'd actually said, only that I had reacted to it. I read the email twice, and then I didn't respond to it at all, because I had finally learned that responding to a non-apology only ever teaches people that a non-apology is enough. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest of my life. I had spent 34 years with my parents as a fixed point in my world, not always a comforting one, but a constant one, the way a mountain is constant even when you don't particularly enjoy looking at it. And suddenly, that fixed point was just gone. I would reach for my phone to call my mother about something small, a recipe, a doctor's appointment, an old habit worn smooth by decades of repetition, and then remember, with a small jolt, that I wasn't doing that anymore. I went through something that felt almost like grief in those first months, even though nobody had died. I grieved the parents I'd always hoped I might eventually have, more than the parents I'd actually had. I grieved the version of the story where they showed up at my door one evening, contrite and clear-eyed, and told me they finally understood. I had to let that version of the story go, slowly, painfully, in order to accept the story that was actually happening. Daniel never once said, "I told you so." He never once brought up the years of small cruelties he'd absorbed to protect our peace. Instead, in the weeks after that dinner, I watched something in him visibly soften. His shoulders sat differently, his laugh came easier. He stopped doing that quiet, careful scrubbing of his hands before we saw my family. Because we simply weren't seeing them anymore. I hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until I watched it leave his body in real time. It broke my heart a little, understanding how long he'd been carrying it silently, and it also confirmed, more than anything else could have, that I had made the right choice. There was a particular Sunday, maybe 6 weeks after the dinner, when I came home from the grocery store and found Daniel in the kitchen, humming to himself, some song I didn't recognize, making a mess of flour trying to bake bread from a recipe his mother used to make. He wasn't stressed about a phone call he needed to return, or a comment he was bracing to hear at some upcoming gathering. He was just there. Present, easy, entirely himself. I stood in the doorway for a full minute just watching him before he noticed me, and I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet astonishment, this is what he's like when he isn't protecting me from something. I hadn't fully understood, until that moment, how much of the man I loved I had never actually gotten to see. My father, it turned out, was not accustomed to consequences. For 34 years, I had been the daughter who smoothed things over, who called back within a day or two, who showed up to keep the peace no matter what had been said or done. When that daughter stopped showing up, he didn't know what to do with the silence. My cousin told me months later that he'd complained bitterly at Thanksgiving that year about his ungrateful daughter, painting himself as the wounded party in a story where he had, in fact, been the one who caused the wound. That didn't surprise me. People who have never had to face consequences for their behavior rarely recognize consequences when they finally arrive. They just experience them as an injustice being done to them. What did surprise me was what happened about 8 months later. My father's law firm went through a restructuring. He had always talked about his position there as untouchable, a monument to his own importance, but it turned out that after 30 years, the younger partners had been quietly maneuvering for a while, and when the firm merged with a larger practice, my father was offered an early retirement package that was really just a polite way of being pushed out. He was 65. He had built his identity so completely around being the successful, important man at the head of the table that losing that position seemed to hollow him out in a way I understood all too well, because I had felt something similar the night I lost my parents. I only know this because my aunt called me, not my mother, who still hadn't reached out with anything resembling an apology, only occasional messages implying I was the one who needed to come around. My aunt told me my father had been struggling, that he'd become withdrawn, that my mother was worried about him but too proud, or too used to my father's pride, to know how to help him through it. She asked, gently, if I might consider reaching out. I sat with that request for a long time. Some part of me, the old part, the part trained over decades to prioritize my parents' comfort over my own boundaries, wanted to call immediately, to rush in and fix things the way I'd always done. But I made myself sit with the discomfort instead of running from it, because I had finally learned the difference between compassion and self-erasure. I talked it through with Daniel, sitting on our back porch one evening, and I remember him saying something that stuck with me: "You're allowed to care about what happens to him without going back to being who you were before." It was such a simple sentence, but it gave me something I hadn't had before: permission to hold both things at once, concern and boundary, without one canceling out the other. I did reach out, eventually. Not to rescue him. Not to smooth things over. I called my mother and said I was sorry to hear my father was struggling, and that I hoped he found peace with the transition. And then I said something I never could have said a year earlier. If either of you ever want a real relationship with me, not a performance, not a photo for the holiday card, but an actual relationship, it starts with acknowledging what happened to Daniel at that dinner. I'm not asking for groveling. I'm asking for honesty. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice I'd never quite heard from her before, smaller, more uncertain, "Your father doesn't really know how to say he's wrong." "I know," I said. "I've known that my whole life. But I'm not willing to keep paying for it anymore." "That's not punishment, Mom. That's just a boundary." It took 4 more months. 4 months of careful, slow, imperfect movement. My father never delivered some cinematic apology, the kind you see in movies where everything is resolved in one tearful monologue. That's not how real people work, especially not people like my father, who had spent 65 years believing that admitting fault was a form of weakness he couldn't afford. What he did instead, eventually, was smaller and stranger and, in its own way, more honest. He showed up at Daniel's garage. Daniel called me that afternoon, his voice careful, like he wasn't quite sure how to tell me. "Your dad came by today," he said. "He wanted his car looked at. Said his usual mechanic retired." I knew that wasn't true. My father had never once mentioned a usual mechanic in his life, and he certainly didn't drive across town to a garage he'd spent years quietly mocking without a reason. "What did he say?" I asked. "Not much, at first. Just sat in the waiting area while I worked on his brakes. Then, when I brought the car around, he said, and I'm quoting this exactly, because I'll probably remember it for the rest of my life, 'You do good work here.' I should have said that a long time ago." I sat down when Daniel told me that. It wasn't an apology, not really. It wasn't the reckoning I might have imagined, years earlier, in angrier moments. But it was something. It was my father, in the only language he had ever really known how to speak, the language of grudging, transactional respect, finally acknowledging that Daniel had built something real with his own hands, something worth respecting. Something my father had spent 7 years pretending not to see because it didn't fit the shape of success he'd built his whole identity around. A few weeks after that, my mother invited us to dinner, a small one, just the 4 of us, no seating chart, no caterer, no audience for anyone to perform in front of. I almost said no out of old habit, out of a fear that walking back through that door meant undoing everything I'd fought to build. Daniel was the one who encouraged me to go, on our terms this time, with a clear understanding between us that we could leave the moment either of us needed to. The dinner was quiet and a little stiff, and nothing like the easy warmth I'd always secretly hoped a family dinner could feel like. But it was honest, in a way our dinners had never been before. At one point, my father asked Daniel a third question, a real one, about how he'd learned to work on engines, about his mother, about the first car he'd ever fixed on his own as a teenager in her driveway, and actually waited for the whole answer instead of steering the conversation back toward himself. It wasn't much. To anyone else at that table, it might have looked like nothing at all. To me, it looked like the first brick of an entirely different wall, one built slowly, imperfectly, out of small moments instead of empty declarations. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the neat, satisfying version of this story. My relationship with my parents never fully returned to what it once was. We see each other now a handful of times a year, birthdays, a holiday or two, careful, measured visits where my father is more polite to Daniel than warm, where my mother still occasionally lets slip a comment that reminds me of who she's always been. I don't think either of them will ever fully become the parents I once, as a little girl, believed they could be. Some people change in small, incomplete ways. Some wounds heal into something functional, but not painless, like a bone that sets a little crooked, but still holds your weight. But something did change permanently, and it wasn't really about them. It was about me. I stopped waiting for my parents' approval to feel whole. I stopped measuring my worth, or Daniel's worth, or the worth of the life we'd built together, against the narrow, brittle standards they'd spent decades trying to impose on me. I learned, finally, at 34 years old, that loving your family does not require accepting their cruelty as the price of admission. I learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are simply the truth of what you will and will not carry anymore. And Daniel, my Daniel, who had spent 7 years quietly absorbing every small humiliation to protect a peace that was never really peace at all, Daniel finally got to sit at a table, in his own home, in his own life, without needing to brace himself for the next quiet cruelty disguised as a joke. I watch him sometimes at our own dinner table, laughing freely, completely at ease, and I think about how long it took me to give him that. I think about how much I owe him for waiting so patiently while I found my courage. We have our own life now, one that looks nothing like the life my mother once pictured for me at brunch with her friends. It includes Sunday mornings at the garage, where I sometimes bring him coffee and sit on an overturned bucket in the corner reading while he works, because I like being near him even when neither of us is saying anything. It includes his mother, who I've come to love fiercely in her own right, a woman who never once looked at me and saw anything other than someone who loved her son well, who taught me more about what real, unconditional family could look like in a handful of visits than my own parents managed in 3 decades. It includes a small, growing garage that now employs 6 people instead of 4, built one satisfied customer at a time by a man nobody in my family thought was building anything worth respecting. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: the people who are supposed to love you the most sometimes need you to show them, clearly and firmly, what love is actually allowed to cost. Not everything, and not everyone, deserves unconditional access to your life simply because of the role they were born into. Respect is not inherited. It's earned, maintained, and, when necessary, revoked, even from the people who once held your whole world in their hands. I didn't cut my parents off out of anger, in the end, even though anger was what pushed me out of that chair on the night it happened. I cut them off out of love for my husband, who deserved a wife willing to defend him, and love for myself, the version of me who had spent too many years shrinking to keep everyone else comfortable. These days, when people ask me if I regret it, I tell them the truth. I regret that it took me 7 years to finally stand up. I don't regret standing up at all. Daniel is at the garage right now, probably elbow deep in someone's engine, whistling some song under his breath, completely unaware that I'm sitting here telling our story to strangers who might need to hear it. Tonight, when he gets home, I'll tell him I love him, and I'll mean it the way I've always meant it, fully, without asking him to shrink himself smaller to fit into a life that was never really built to hold him in the first place. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Some are only worth walking away from, so you can finally build a home on solid ground instead. That's what we did. And I have never once looked back.